All right, well, welcome back. Today we are in part 3 of our series we started a few weeks ago called Breathing Room. And I want to begin by telling you to do something that if you're a parent in the room, you're going to be like, are you serious? That's what I tell my kid not to do. But I'm going to tell you to do something that might be odd, but I'll explain a little why. And here's what I want to tell you to do today as we start out. I want you to cheat wisely. All right, I want you to cheat wisely. So we're going to be really good at cheating today. And so I'll explain that in just a minute. If we began this series called Breathing Room a few weeks back, and if you remember, I said the definition of breathing room is this. Breathing room is the space between our current pace and our limits. And here's what we know about limits, that we all have limits. And if you remember that whenever we hit our limit, oftentimes we lose control of our life, right? We drop everything because we've hit a certain limit. And so breathing room is about operating not that way where you crash and you burn and you all of a sudden lose control of everything, but learning to operate at a healthy pace. And in part 1 of the series, just to kind of take us back since we're closing out the series this week, we said it's really about faith. We talked about faith, oxygen, please, that we all need a little oxygen in our life. And we said we create breathing room by trusting in our Creator. And if you don't follow Jesus, just so you know, one of the things that Jesus followers believe is that Jesus actually commanded that we take a whole day off, and he calls it the Sabbath day. And so we said there was a day called the Sabbath day set up for our entire life, that God instituted this command to take a day off. In other words, take a day to breathe. And if you were a person growing up in that society, if you remember about this, we talked about this, and you should go back and listen to part 1 if you didn't hear part 1, because part 1 was so instrumental to the whole series. But just to take you back, because this is so fundamental to this, and I want you to get it more than anything. In the very beginning, when there was an agricultural society, to take a day off would be a massive decision. It wouldn't be like, just take a Saturday or Sunday off in our context. A day of taking a day off, if you remember this, would be a day of potentially maybe not eating the next day because all the preparation that went in for the following days. And so to take a whole day off was very, very risky move. But it was a way of distributing and showing and demonstrating trust in the Creator. And so we just simply said, to create breathing room, you got to trust in your Creator. And we'll talk a little more about that today as well. And then in part 2, we talked about time. We looked at the calendar, and we said for some of us, your calendar is killing you. The calendar, always demanding. And we said that the calendar in order for us to do this properly, according to God's order, we've got a calendar in ways today that leads you to live for the Lord tomorrow. That this is a really allow more breathing room in your life, not where you're just adding God on the backside, but you're starting with Him. That everything starts with Him because we seek Him first. We learned about that last week as well in Matthew chapter 6. We'll read about that again today. A lot of reinforcement in this lesson. So, calendar in ways today that leads us to live for the Lord tomorrow. All right, so today, as we unpack this series, I want to begin in the year, we're going to go back a couple of years, 2016. 2016, just a little bit about me and about our church kind of history. So if today you're here for the first time, that's good because you get a little more of the history of our church. And so started in 2016. And I remember the very first day on the job, and I pulled into a Starbucks because we didn't have an office, we didn't have anything, and so we didn't have a building yet, a location to meet at yet. I mean, nothing. It was me, and that was it. Okay, and of course a handful of people that were going to come eventually. If I got something going, they were going to come to help. But I remember sitting at a Starbucks. It was my first day on the job. Never led a church, never planted a church in my life. I mean, I highly don't recommend it. And but it was well worth it. You're worth it. You're worth it. And but I was sitting there at the Starbucks, and I called up James, one of my overseers, kind of a guy who was further down the road. And this is what I asked him. I said, "Hey, James. Hey, how's it going, man?" He was all excited for me. I said, "I don't know what to do." And then he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "No, seriously. What do I do?" He said, "What do you mean, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I mean, I don't have a boss right now. I'm the boss, and this is kind of weird, and I have nobody to boss but me, and I don't know what to do. So what do I begin?" And so I literally had no idea where to begin on the job. So here's what I did, and I didn't even know this was like a thing to do, but this is what I did. In fact, books recommend you do this as far as the organization. Here's what I did. I created an organizational chart. That just shows you, like, that's the first task I did. I created this organizational chart, and I just started putting, like, the picture of, like, what the church that I wanted to see God do. I began to put, like, titles and positions, and then to organize the things in structure, and that's where I began. And I looked at this organizational chart as I created it and unfolded it, and I was like, all right, we're gonna have a person here, we're gonna have a person here, and then here's what I did next. I just put my name in every box. And I was like, all right, so how am I gonna do that? And then I found Andrews, and I put his name in one box, and then we talked to him, and maybe a couple more boxes, and then eventually, I just began to put some names in boxes, and here's the whole point, as I began to look at that space in my life, and I'm telling you, here's what I found out, and here's what I discovered first several years of planning this church. My breathing room was scarce. I mean, I had very little breathing room. I remember having conversations with my wife, Carissa. Of course, at the time we had 2 children. She was pregnant with our third. She was working full-time in St. Pete. That's where she still works today, but she was working full-time. So she was driving 5 days a week, an hour each way. And I remember having a conversation with her, and I was watching our second child. He was not able to be in VPK yet, so I was watching him in the day while also starting the church. And so he watched Toy Story literally every single day. I mean, it was like Toy Story 1, Toy Story 2, Toy Story 1, 2, and then Big Hero 6. And it was just like, I mean, he got so much Disney Plus, it was crazy. All right, so, but this was my life growing up, and then, or in this season of my life. And so I remember having this conversation with Carissa one day, and I was like, man, the hours of 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. are the hardest hours of my day. And I remember having a conversation with her thinking, man, if I could just have you home from like somewhere between 3 to 6 as all the chaos is unbounding. And so I had to find a way to work from the kids in the school in the morning. My oldest daughter was going off to school. Then I had to figure out how to handle Sam at the same time. Then I was trying to also plant and start a church and have conversations with every single person I possibly could, and meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, and writing after writing after writing, and all the things that went into it. And breathing room got really, really scarce. And so here's what I ended up doing as a result, and this is just confession. This is what I ended up doing. I ended up cheating on my home life with my work life. Eventually, what I began to do, and this has just happened to me, I began to cheat on me. I began to cheat on my time for me. In fact, I cheated on my time for me so bad, it ended up leading me eventually into hospitals and to stress-induced all kinds of issues in my life began to unfold in 2019, a few years after planning the church. And eventually, I began to work in the morning. I know none of you do this. You wake up and you think about work, and I know none of you do that. And then in the middle of the day, of course, I'm working, and then at nighttime, I'm working. I mean, I know none of you have any clue what I'm talking about. I'm going to bed, and I'm thinking about work. I'm waking up, and I'm thinking about work. I'm on a date with my wife, and I'm talking about work. I mean, again, none of you do that. And so for me, I began to talk about work, and work began to dominate my life, and that means you, all of you, began to dominate my life. And I began to think about you, and I could just not figure out how to say no to you. I could not figure out how to say no to people that needed me, people that wanted to talk to me. I had to say yes and yes and yes and yes and yes and yes and yes because of so many reasons. And here's what ultimately I did not do. I did not cheat wisely. I did not cheat wisely. I end up cheating on the wrong things in my life. And ultimately, and we talked about this in the week, but the reason I did it was all rooted in fear. I mean, we said that ultimately the reasons why oftentimes we overload our calendar and overload our lives is because of this word called fear. And 4 specific fears, if you don't have them, you can rewrite them down, but there's all about these in part 1. We said fear of missing out. I fear missing out on something. You know what I feared missing out in planning the church? Having a conversation with somebody who would come in and say, hey, how can we help you build the church and plant the church? I mean, I feared I'm missing out on a conversation, on an opportunity that could help grow or establish the church, getting it ready. I feared on falling behind. What if we fall behind? What if we don't make it fast enough? What if we don't grow? What if we don't do this? What if we miss the opportunity? Fear of missing out. Fear of letting others down. That was a huge one. Chris and I, at one point, this is true, we actually had people in our house every night of the week. Every single night from like 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., we were cooking a meal for families in their church every single night, all because I had a fear of letting people down. I couldn't just say no. And then ultimately, fear of insignificance. that we weren't going to matter. We would not be a church that matters in our community, that if we closed down, no one would miss us. In fact, people would be like, hey, I don't even know who that church was to begin with, right? I just had this fear of insignificance. And oftentimes we know this, that our fears, your fears and my fears, oftentimes, if you can go to the next so they can see it, our fears often lead us into doing more while pulling us away from doing what matters most. And for me, I ended up literally cheating on my home life, on even my personal life, for the sake of my work life. And here's what's really crazy about the whole thing, and I wonder if you can relate to this. I honestly, if you were to talk to me in that season of my life, and by the way, seasons are seasons because they end. By the way, if you're still in the same season for the past 5 years, you're not in a season, that's your life. And so for me, this is what I felt. I felt like I didn't have any choice. I mean, if you were to ask me, I'd say this is just the beginning. This is just what happens in the beginning. This is just the way it is. I don't have any choice. This is just the predicament I'm in. But ultimately, I realized later on that really this was a trust issue. And the question I had to ask myself, and the question I want you to ask yourself today, invite you into this whole thing, is this: did I or do I really trust God? There's 3 statements that I would read through Scripture. And there was 3 statements that I still read through Scripture today that I still even wrestle with to this very day. Do I really trust these statements of Jesus? Because I began to realize if I could begin to trust these statements of Jesus, I would have way more breathing room. And maybe if you began to trust in the statements that I'm going to show you today, maybe you too could find more breathing room, so that you don't hit your limit, because we all know what happens when you hit your limit. You drop everything. And then ultimately, when you drop everything, someone else has to come and pick it up. So, how do we create more breathing room? I'm going to give you 3 statements that Jesus said, or statements about Jesus, that I want to invite you in to trust today. And I think if we do that, we'll find more breathing room. So here's the first one. Matthew chapter 6, we'll go back there. I told you in part 1, we're going to go back to this one a couple of times, and here's the delivery of that promise. Here it is. Here's what Jesus said. Jesus said, don't worry. What shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. He knows everything you need. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. And for me, I began to look at this. In fact, this was the first verse that was written in the Bible that was given to me, like gifted. The first Bible gifted to me, this verse was written in there. So you think I would have gotten it. And that was August 9th of 1997. So you would think, man, I would have absorbed this by now. But seek first the kingdom of God and all of its righteousness, and everything else, all these things will be given to you as well. But the trust issue I had was this. God. Yes, you are creator of the whole world. I know you made the sun and everything, and you own all the land. But do you think you could please build the church? Is it possible for you to establish a church that really makes a difference in a community? Can you do that without me, God? Are you powerful enough? And I just began to believe that no, he couldn't do that. Like it was me, it was on my shoulders. And if I didn't put every single hour I could, well then he couldn't pull it off without me. You ever felt like God can't pull stuff off without you? Like he needs you in order to accomplish something, And so for me, I began to be so convinced that no, he needs me in order to be able to pull that off and to do that thing. Notice that this text says that Jesus said that there's a part that we have to obey. He talks about his kingdom. He says, seek first his kingdom. So you say, what's his kingdom like? Did you know in his kingdom, people don't worry? In his kingdom, people don't worry. In his kingdom, there's no passcodes. In his kingdom, there's no locks on doors. In his kingdom, there's absolute security. In his kingdom, you do not have to worry about being without. In his kingdom, every soul is at rest with peace and joy and contentment. But that kingdom does not exist here. He says you have to seek out that kingdom while you are here. And so for me, I wrestle with this trust issue of, is this actually true? I mean, even today, come on. Is it really possible to not worry? I mean, come on, Jesus, let's talk about that. So for me, it came down to, do I really believe that if I sought after his kingdom, if I just obeyed his teaching? Why do I say obey his teaching? Because I don't know if you know this, but in his kingdom, no one disobeys his teaching. In his kingdom, everyone does exactly what he says. And so, the invitation from Jesus is, if you seek my kingdom, if you obey my teaching, I will give you everything you need. Do I really trust that statement? For many years, the answer is no. Second statement that I had to learn to trust comes from a writing of a guy named Paul. He writes to a church in Rome, and here's what Paul says about Jesus. He says this, and we know that God works for the good of all those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. That God works all things out for their good and ultimately his glory. I mean, I had to wrap my head around this. Maybe for some of you, this is a wrestling thing too that you could wrestle with. But for me personally, in that season of my life, I had to think, do you work all things out for my good? I mean, you can't possibly work this out. I mean, this is happening, and there was so much difficulty and so many challenges in planning the church and getting the church started, and so many from financial to people. And I don't know if you know this, but people are hard. I don't know if you know that. None of you are hard. None of you. But people can be challenging. Leading people can be challenging. And so it just became so incredibly difficult, so incredibly challenging. And I could just, God, are you sure you could take this and turn it into good? Because I'm looking around and I don't see a lot of good. I began to have to wrestle with this idea. Can I really trust that God? Can you trust God? Can you trust God? That he works all things out for your good and his glory. I mean, think about all the trials you face, all the scenarios you face, all the things that happen in your job, and oftentimes you try to cram and solve, and how your world might look different, how my world might look different, and we actually begin to trust that God turns all things out for the good of those who love him. That he can turn all things out. All things for the better. All things that happened to you yesterday, last week. He could take all those things and turn them for your good and his glory. How much more breathing room would we have in our life if we can learn to trust this statement? And here's the third statement. Paul is writing, and here's the interaction with Paul, and he says this in his relationship and his conversation with God. You can go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Again, do we have that up? It says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. He's talking about a thorn in his side. He's got this issue in his life. Even at one statement he says that Satan, like this messenger of Satan, is attacking him. And he says, this big enemy in his life. He says, but he said to me, this is God speaking to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly. I'm going to be all pumped up, excited about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Imagine how much breathing room you would have in your life if you realize that God's grace goes with you everywhere you go. And for me, this is how it looked for me, just realizing it and recognizing that everything that happens through this church, and I just didn't realize it. I thought it was actually all on my shoulders. It was all for me to do. It was all for me to accomplish. And then I began to look around and I realized, wait a second, everything I have, and this is what Paul is getting at, everything I possess, everything that I accomplish, none of it happens because of me. It all happens because of you. It's your grace working through me. And I began to realize it is God's grace, the power of recognizing that your grace is sufficient, that your grace pulls me through seasons, your grace gets me through days. I thought there's no way this could happen. And then you get on the backside of those trials, you get on the backside of those scenarios in life, and you look back and you go, that was God's grace That God's grace is sufficient. I remember seeing a sermon, I've preached on it before, using it as an illustration, so I don't have one with me, but imagine I have an umbrella. And I remember seeing, using an umbrella, just the picture of God's grace, how it covers us everywhere we go. And if we get out from underneath this grace, we get soaking wet with trials and get frantic and panic and do all kinds of sorts of things, but we could just learn to live under the grace of God. That everything happens through this church, and every person that gets saved and every person that changes their life has nothing and so little to do with me or our own people. It's all by his grace. And I will tell you this, and this is just the truth of what I began to realize. And I hope this, for some of you, I wrote this in prayerfully this morning, and I'm not trying to be over spiritual about this, but in my prayer time this morning, I put this statement in for someone in here today. This was absolutely a truth for me that I began, and I hope it penetrates your heart if the Lord intends it for you. When we know we have grace, we don't shy away from taking breathing room. When you recognize that his grace goes with you, you do not shy away from saying no to that meeting. I mean, this is just true because I'm trying to do everything I could at the time to help the church, grow the church, do whatever I could to establish the church. And I thought, man, if I miss out on that meeting, I'm missing out on an opportunity, and who knows what God's gonna do with this opportunity. So I would say no to my wife, I'd say no to my family, I'd say no to me, because I didn't want to miss out. I was fear of missing out. And when I was operating in that moment, I was outside of that umbrella of grace. Forgetting that God's grace goes with me everywhere I go. Think about your own schedule. Think about your own timetable. Think about how God's grace goes with you and how you might breathe a little differently, knowing that God's grace has you. Think about how worry has you frantic because you can't see your kids 24/7. Maybe they're out and they're about, or they're grown up, or they're outside the house, or they're different situations and environment. Can I just remind you today that Jesus sees them too? I mean, Jesus actually, do you think, and I know we get in this moment, we can get so frantic and pack things in. God, can you handle our children? I can't. He's like, yeah, I handled you. I can handle them too. Yeah, I got you. So just recognizing his grace. What if you don't perfectly parent? His grace goes with you. That's the beauty of his grace. That's why Paul could say, I boast in all of my weaknesses, because his grace helps me through all things. His grace walks with me. When you know that you have God's grace, you breathe a little more. So this past week, I got a chance to go to Dallas while all this is fresh. Got a chance to travel up to Dallas this past week, spend some time with my wife at a church network gathering, and met with a lot of lead pastors from around the nation, even in different countries, and a lot of conversations and stuff like that. So in this kind of reflection week, for me personally, this message even hit home for me personally. And for me, I was actually, just to be fully transparent, not making it about me today, but I know, I recognize I'm talking a lot about me, but hopefully it's helpful for you. But I was in the hotel room, and I have past couple of weeks just like, man, very little breathing room. I need more breathing room. And so the sermon's just for me, as much as I teach it, it's also for me. And so I was there in the hotel room and journaling and just talking with the Lord and praying with the Lord. And I began to recognize and realize that, man, I'm still like I was 8 years ago so many times in my life, where I find myself feeling the weight, carrying the weight, feeling like it's all on me. And I began to just journal out to the Lord. I said, Lord, and I remember just writing this statement in my journal just a few days ago. I said, I'm giving it back. Here's what I told him. I said, I'm giving the church back. Because in the moment I did that, I thought, man, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I just need more breathing room? I got to create more margin for my kids and family, but I can't say no to this. How do I not work between this? How do I not say no? Who do I say no to? Who do I say yes to? Who do I cheat on? Who do I not cheat on? How do I do this? How do I manage all the tensions that you all have to manage every day? We have 4 kids and sports and work and jobs and the whole thing. How do we get this breathing room? Because me and my wife did something we haven't done in 17 years. We took 2 nights in a row to have dinner. It was awesome. I mean, it was a second, wow, this is 2 dates in a row. This is fantastic. So we just said, how do we create more breathing room? So I'm in the conversation with God. I said, God, I know what I got to do. I just got to resurrender everything and put it back in your hand and trust you. I mean, it was so simple. And yet I wish I could tell you that, yeah, I learned that lesson 8 years ago because we've been in church now for 8 years, but I'm still learning that lesson. It's still something that I find myself inattention in. And so here's what I told him. I'm just going to do my best and leave the rest to you. I'm going to do my best and leave the rest to you. I'll do my best at my job, and you do what only you can do. I'll give you 45 hours, and that's all I can give you, Jesus. And if you can do whatever you want to do in that 45 hours, I'll be fine with it. But beyond that, I'm not giving you more than that. That's all I can give you. And then I just have to trust him that he can actually do more with my little than I can with stressing out and doing everything I can to establish and build. And the same is true for so many of us in our different areas of life or different respected organizations or businesses or companies or jobs that we manage or lead. So 3 questions I want to ask you today, and maybe invite you to ask even Jesus himself. And questions for you. Do I believe that if I do what he says, he'll meet my needs? Today is just really about a trust examination for you. Do you really believe that he will do what he says he'll do, and he'll meet your needs if you just do what he says? Do you believe that? Do you believe if you do what he says, if you structure your calendar the way that he says to structure your calendar, he'll meet your needs? If you give what he says to give, do you believe he'll actually meet your needs if you do what he says? Do you trust him that if you believe that if he works all things out for the good, do you actually believe that he can work all things out for your good and his glory? You really believe that? And then finally, do you believe his grace is sufficient? That his grace actually is enough? His grace, his goodness is enough for you? The invitation ultimately, like I said, as a title, to go back to the title, is simply this: to cheat wisely. The invitation is you're going to cheat something. I remember hearing this statement a long time ago. If you're going to cheat on something, choose what you cheat on wisely. For me, I was going to cheat on my job. I was going to cheat on my wife with you. I was going to cheat on my family with someone from the church, or doing another graphic for the church, or setting up another organizational chart for, doing whatever I could for my job. I was going to have to learn to cheat. But when I began to learn, and I continue to learn each time, choose who you cheat wisely. Every time you say yes to one thing, you say no to something else. So choose what you cheat wisely. Ultimately, it came down to the statement, and this is the walk away from today. Simply this: when it comes to cheating, cheat the thing that someone else will do for what's unique to you. You know what's unique for me? It's not being a pastor or church planner. It's what I do, but eventually somebody else will do it. You know what's unique to me? Carissa's husband. I hope. Okay, so I'm only going to be a husband, God willing, of one, right? Like, that's unique to me. The father to my children, that's unique to me. That doesn't change. So why would I ever trade what someone else will do for something that's unique to me? That's a terrible trade when you think about it. So think about the investment, the breathing room. When you're going to those moments and you're having to make decisions between who do I cheat on? Well, it's easy. Cheat the thing that someone else will do for what's unique to you. And this isn't like an absence of responsibility. This is not like a get out of jail free card, a Monopoly that says, you know what, I'm stopping everything, I'm doing nothing. That would be hitting your limit. Because when you stop everything and do nothing, eventually you hand all that stuff to someone else to carry. It's just learning to say, I'm going to operate differently with a little more margin, a little more breathing room. And when my sticky notes start to get everywhere, I need to look and prioritize. How do I prioritize? Well, when I'm in the place of choosing what to cheat on, this is how you decide. What can someone else do and will do? I'm not going to exchange that for what's unique to me. Only thing that I can do, that no one else can do or will do. It's unique to me. And that can help us, I believe, create more breathing room in our life. So just imagine with me as we close out, just imagine what would happen. The breathing room that you and I would create if we would just allow to choose to trust that God knows all of our needs. He works out all things for our good, and his grace goes with us. What would your life look like? What would your calendar look like? What would your time look like? What would your finances look like? What would your spending look like? What would the budget look like if you begin to actually trust that do what he says, that if I do what he says, well, he'll meet my needs. His grace goes with me. He works out all things for my good. He does not leave me. He does not abandon me. I think, and I hope, and I pray for all of us in this room that we would learn to walk with a little more breathing room in our life, in our calendar, and ultimately, too, in our relationships with people. That in our relationships, we'd create more breathing room, more margin for our marriages, more margin for our children, more margin, more time to create that space for one another. Because ultimately, you should, and I should, make a good trade. Don't trade what someone else could do for what's unique to you. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this time, and I pray, Father, that there would be more breathing room, that you would teach us, like the scripture said, to number our days, and to remember, Lord, that the days are counted, and to give us wisdom, a heart of wisdom, to help us to spend our days wisely, to choose wisely what we cheat on, to prioritize the things of you and your kingdom above our own, to prioritize your kingdom above the things of our world, to prioritize the things that you call us to above the things that we desire, to prioritize our families and our time with you above, well, our time at